in Iraq, and it is used by police forces around the world, including Britain. And the idea is that if Israel is allowed to assassinate people without a trial, for example, which one of the systems of control that Israel applies, then why shouldn't other countries be allowed to do that? I said I'll go back to why Israel was accepted into the OECD. The main leader of the OECD countries that wanted Israel to join and physically embraced Netanyahu when Netanyahu came to the ceremony of joining the OECD is Berlusconi. And Berlusconi, being a right-wing leader himself, would like to adopt some of Israel's methods of controlling immigrant populations, controlling Muslim populations, and clamping on civil liberties in Italy as well. And Israel is one of his main ways to do that politically. So this is, but of course, the political support that Israel receives from Italy and from right-wing parties in Europe is quite small compared to the support it receives from the U.S. And let me say something about this graph, which perhaps sheds some light on the reasons why the U.S. specifically supports Israel so strong. This graph shows it was compiled by two professors, Shimshon Bichler and Jonathan Itzhak, and it shows the relative profit of weapon and oil companies traded in the U.S. stock exchange to all the profits of other companies traded in the U.S. stock exchange. So it doesn't show them the actual profit, it shows the relative profit, whether they profit more than the average or under the average. When they profit more than the average, these are the gray bars going up. When they profit under the average, these are the black areas going down. And Shimshon Bichler and Jonathan Itzhak call these periods of time a danger zone. Why do they call it that? Because after every time when oil and weapon companies don't meet the quota of profit that they are expecting, you see, not every time, but most times, you see a little explosion or several explosions in the graph, and the direction of the graph changes. These explosions all represent wars in the Middle East between at least one country which is either oil producing or has major oil pipelines going through it. And in most of these wars, not all of them, but in most of them, the other country involved in the war is Israel. Israel does not produce oil, nor does it have major pipelines going through it. And yet, Israel is often the country that is used to instigate these Middle East conflicts and jack up the price of oil, jack up the price of weapons, and increase, of course, the profits accordingly. Now, I want to address this kind of this theory, which I imagine many of you heard, that AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in the U.S., has a firm control over the U.S. government and somehow manipulates the U.S. government from behind the scenes. And I don't subscribe to that theory at all. I think we should look at it differently. We should look at the budget of AIPAC and see that AIPAC actually has just 1% of the budget of the lobby of Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is the world's biggest weapons manufacturers. They are the one who make the F-15s and F-16s. And just their lobby budget is 100 times bigger than AIPAC. And of course, their overall budget as a company is something of a completely different magnitude. But of course, if a presidential candidate in the US would meet up with the Lockheed Martin lobby in public and say, we assure you that there are going to be lots of wars in the Middle East, so your profits will remain high, that's not going to look so good, and that's not going to be very acceptable. But if instead they meet with AIPAC, like they do indeed, all of them, and say, Israel is the staunch ally of the US, and the US will always support Israel no matter what Israel does, the message is loud and clear. The message is the Middle East is not going to be pacified anytime soon, and the profits of Lockheed Martin are safe. Lockheed Martin and the other weapon companies. And of course that is also represented through the aid that the US gives to Israel, which actually is subsidies to the weapon companies and not to the Israeli people. And this is also manifested very well in the quote from Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State of the US, who said that for every tank that the US gives to Israel for free, the neighbors of Israel buy 4 tanks from the US. Now, much of that situation is perhaps changing now with the revolutions in the Middle East, which I assume you're following. and maybe we can talk about that in the questions phase if you want. But I do want to finish with one point, that it is all nice and well to talk about the facts and the analysis, but let's try to ask ourselves also what kind of action we can take in order to address this. And I'd like to turn your attention to the Palestinian Civil Society call of 2005 for boycott, divestment and sanctions, BDS. And this call was endorsed by virtually all civil society organizations in Palestine, virtually all labor unions, political parties, communities in the diaspora of Palestinians, of course, refugee communities, and also Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this call is a call designed to create economic and cultural pressure on Israel in order to get some changes in Israeli policy. And the demands made by the BDS movement are three. One, that Israel must withdraw from occupied Arab land. Two, that Israel must recognize the equal rights of all of its citizens, including, of course, Palestinian citizens. And three, Israel must recognize the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And these three demands are already embedded into international law. So you could just shorten it and say Israel should respect international law. And that is the demand. I can talk a little bit about how BDS is achieved through its economic aspect, through divesting from not just Israeli companies but also international companies that support Israel and provide illegal services to Israel in the occupied territories, and the cultural boycott, which has been very effective in making Israelis aware that the world is waking up and starting to demand that Israel will become accountable for its crimes, and the academic boycott, which is very effective in getting the elites in Israel, who are more educated and more eloquent, to start to realize that the situation is not sustainable and they have to explain to the Israeli public that things must change. And this movement is growing very fast. It has, of course, taken a lot of inspiration from South Africa and the boycott campaign against South Africa. But South Africa was under a boycott campaign for decades before eventually succumbing to democracy and allowing equal rights to everyone. The BDS campaign is under 6 years old, and it's already very widespread and very advanced in its stage. One more very important point that I have to make is that boycott is not an embargo. There is a difference. And the Palestinian call for boycott makes that perfectly clear, that they don't ask the international community to do to Israel what Israel is doing to Gaza. It's not about a siege, it's not about an embargo, there's no attempt to make Israelis poor or that they should want for anything. There's no call that forbids the international community to sell not forbids, that even requests that the international community will refrain from selling food or consumer products to Israel. That is, of course, acceptable, anything except weapons, of course. But the point is to target the elites in Israel who have the power to change the situation. That's also true for the academic boycott and the cultural boycott, which are not blanket boycotts against Israelis. It's not targeted at individuals at all. It's about institutions. Because, for example, most Israeli universities, almost all of them unfortunately, are involved in the occupation, in repression, in apartheid, in a very straightforward way, through various means. I can, of course, elaborate on that if you want. And so these are not legitimate institutions. So the boycott is only on the institutions, not on the individuals. And I want just to finish by saying that the boycott movement is not about changing the opinions of Israelis. Because there is no historical precedent of a colonizing power just waking up one morning and saying, oh, we're so sorry, we've been wrong, now we are going to withdraw. That's not going to happen. It is about trying to get to make the Israeli society understand there is no choice but to accept the rights of Palestinians. It's not about convincing people. And like what we saw in South Africa, 1 week before the fall of apartheid, the vast majority of the white population in South Africa were all supporting apartheid. And they didn't want the black population to have the vote. And 1 week after the collapse of apartheid, everyone were saying we were always against apartheid. First we change the political situation, and then the opinions will change as well. So I'll stop now so we can have more time for discussion, and thank you very much.